Greetings, respected viewers. I'm George from Ireland, and behind me is the world infamous Leatherslade Farm. And those of you who are into your British criminal history will know this is where the great train robbers had their flop in August 1963. So the great train robbers consisted of the Goody Reynolds gang, rather informal gang, and then the South Coast Raiders. The South Coast Raiders had stopped a number of trains in the late 50s, early 60s. So the plot was hatched to stop the Glasgow to London mail. I don't propose to recap the story of the robbery in great detail. And so 8th of August 1963 is when it was stopped, and this plan had been in the offing for about a year. Bruce Reynolds, you should read his an autobiography of a thief, and he recounts trying to stop the Irish mail out of Paddington, stopping it at West Ealing, and it not being particularly successful. But they had their eyes on a bigger prize. They thought of trying to stop a train carrying gold from South Africa, which came by the Union Castle liners by sea. But that was too closely guarded, and they realised a lot of cash was put into mail bags brought down to London for distribution, or indeed withdrawn banknotes to be burnt. Why not burn them in Glasgow? And so they stopped the train about 2:30 in the morning in Buckinghamshire. We're here in Buckinghamshire, 27 miles as the crow flies at Sears Crossing. And so they removed about 120 mail bags, 16 men who were part of the gang, and they brought them here. Now, they bought Leatherslade Farm a few months earlier. Brian Field was the solicitor's clerk who had conveyanced the sale. So the idea was to lay up here for a few days until the hoo-ha died down. There need to be a great outcry when it happened, a hue and cry, and police roadblocks everywhere. So, and they got back to Leatherslade Farm feeling absolutely jubilant, as you can imagine. Now, Bruce Reynolds would have us believe they lustily sang a chorus of some rousing song on the way back. Now, either the people of Buckinghamshire are tone deaf, or sort of absolutely stone deaf, or else Bruce Reynolds is telling porky pies. Yes, yet again, he does like to embellish. Anyway, they didn't want to attract attention, and so allegedly they played Monopoly with real money. There's the farmhouse, and Ronnie Biggs, one of the gang, it was his birthday, so all gave him a £5 as a birthday present, but £5 then was worth about £100 now, so it was a considerable sum of money, and they had enough food to last several days, and indeed firkins of beer. But it all gang awry. So they told the people like Jack Mills, the train driver, and his assistant not to move for 30 minutes. The police turned up, and the 30 minutes turned into 30 miles. The police wrongly thought they were within 30 miles of here. But 30 minutes, you'd only drive about 15 miles through the narrow, twisty roads of the Buckinghamshire countryside, not wanting to drive too fast and attract attention. Remember, in the early 60s, most people couldn't afford a car. So particularly in rural Buckinghamshire. And they stolen 2 Land Rovers for this robbery, which they'd repainted in army colours. Incidentally, don't get the impression trying to glamorise the crime. I'm not. It was a brutal crime. They hit Jack Mills over the head several times with an iron bar. That could have killed him. He didn't hit his head just once falling, which the robbers falsely claimed. He was brain damaged. He died several years later, admittedly from leukemia, but that could easily have killed him. Another train could have come along and smacked into the back of that mail train and killed loads of passengers. They didn't know that no more trains were coming that night. It was just a good fortune that no train was on that line. So they'd obviously terrorised the postal workers. How would I have felt with these masked guys in uniforms come here, swinging billy clubs and uttering blood-curdling threats? They got away with £2.5 million, which was a mind-blowing sum of money in 1963. So the idea is once the police roadblocks were withdrawn, they were then safely go back to London. They could have got fast cars and hightailed it back to London that night, been back in central London within an hour, there being no traffic. But they said that will attract too much attention. The other factor is they thought that they couldn't trust each other with the money, and they tuned into police radio. And when they got back to the farm, they obviously felt triumphant, but they heard one police officer say to another, "You're not going to believe this. Somebody just stole a fucking train." You wouldn't believe it, would you? Anyway, so one of the local farmers had come around a few days before the robbery and asked whether he could rent a field, because the previous owner had allowed him to rent one of the fields off the owner of Leatherslade Farm. And Bruce Reynolds said, "Well, I'm not the new proprietor, but I'll let him know." He'd made the elementary mistake of allowing a neighbour to see his face. Anyway, a few days after the robbery, a local farmer, he contacted the police, and he said he'd noticed an unusual amount of activity. Cars he'd never seen before coming to and from Leatherslade Farm, and herd cars in the dead of night leaving Leatherslade Farm right before the robbery, coming back a couple of hours later. Is something up? Because the police, they had their informants in the underworld, and within hours of the robbery, the police had several names, most of which proved to be correct as being involved in the robbery. So they put the redoubtable Tommy Butler, One Day Tommy, on the case. Detective Superintendent Butler was known as One Day because he'd arrest thieves within 1 day of the robbery, or thief taker, like an 18th century informal title for a detective. So anyway, the police were closing in, and there was rising panic here amongst the thieves, as the police believed them to be within a 30-mile radius of the scene of the crime, which indeed was correct. So you'd think the thieves have been quite smart, chosen someone somewhere far away, but not too far away. They could have gone 50 miles away, but then they would have been driving as dawn broke or something. So they decided they're going to hightail it and leave slightly earlier than they'd planned. They were going to stay for 5 days. I think they left after 4 days. So they hightailed it out of there. They tried burning some of the mail sacks. There were several outbuildings they'd used as well. But it gave off black smoke, which they thought was going to attract too much attention. So they left some of the Irish and Scots banknotes. They just took the Bank of England ones. They'd got the 2 Army Land Rovers, well, ordinary Land Rovers. They'd repainted in Army colours. They'd worn Army uniforms to pretend they were on night exercises if they were stopped by the local constabulary. And Bruce Reynolds even said he wore the sand-coloured beret of the SAS, living out his fantasy of being Popsky's private army. So then they drove to Cabry, the house of Brian Field, the solicitor's clerk who had processed the sale, which is on the outskirts of Reading. And of course the neighbours noticed a lot of quite smart cars arriving there, and that caused comment. So they'd failed a sort of nursery test. They were meant to be top echelon criminals, but they slipped up time and again. So they had paid someone to come and clean the farm who did a real slapdash job. And so a local constable at Brill station, and Brill, well, you can't quite see it, but in that direction, just a couple of miles, Constable John Mills was phoned up by his superior and said, "Do you know where Leatherslade Farm is? You know, the area like the back of your hand?" And indeed he did. It had been sold just a few months previously. So he cycled up the bridle way. It's a public right of way. You can't get right up into the farm. It's fenced off, big gate, security camera, 2 vicious hounds, so don't try going over the fence. And let's go and take a look. And so he cycled up there, but nobody was there. And what's that? Ooh, Land Rovers, partly repainted, but the rest of it still in Army colours. They're not finished that off. And then there's little sort of campfire here with the charred remnants of, looks like mail bags. Looking into one of the sheds there, mail bags. What's in them? Banknotes. And then looking in the window, there half-eaten slices of toast. The table is strewn with cups, plates, and cutlery. So what's going on here? Knock on the door. Hello, hello, anybody home? Nobody's there. So call for backup. If he'd gone then, there were 16 thugs. He might well have been killed. But so the criminals were back in London, and there was pandemonium amongst them when should they go back and burn the farm? Because yes, that would have attracted attention, but it would have destroyed all the evidence. There'd be no fingerprints. There'd be no mail sacks. Even if you don't take the Irish and Scots banknotes, they've been destroyed. Remember, in the Republic of Ireland, the Irish pound then was exactly the same value as the pound sterling. We accepted the pound sterling at the time, although the United Kingdom did not accept Irish pounds. So that they considered going back to do that, and they were having a meeting at a greasy spoon about it when someone came with a newspaper and said, "Look at the headline, robbers hideout found." So that is the famous Leatherslade Farm. I don't remember who owns it, and you can read a fabulous book, came out a couple of years ago, I forget the author's name, about the Great Train Robbery. It meant to be the definitive story, demolishing the myth that it was the crime of the century, that it was a work of genius. The bloke who did that, he said, Bruce Reynolds, when he was on his travels, he later had a neighbour in Mexico or something who'd once lived at Leatherslade Farm. What are the chances of that? So some of these criminals were rather superstitious. And one of the guys, members of the gang, he was a fanatic for the GGs, as in a horse racing enthusiast. He was a betting man. So and he was going to lay his wager on this great train robbery, because he said, guess who run the Grand National? That's the most famous horse race in the United Kingdom. Who won the Grand National in 1936? He says to Bruce Reynolds, leader of the gang, and Bruce Reynolds says, I don't know. And the guy said, a horse called Reynoldstown. And guess who won the 1937 Grand National? Bruce Reynolds says, I don't know, tell me. And the bloke says, Royal Mail. So it seemed like an omen, so a portent of good luck. Obviously, you know, they almost all got caught. About 3 of them were never apprehended. Some of them spent their money quite quickly, and some of them spent it on bribes to help the escape. Ronnie Biggs on plastic surgery to disguise himself, although he seemed to look just the same afterwards as he had done before, and on and on. So they actually didn't live on high on the hog. But Bruce Reynolds made money out of it, constantly writing for The Guardian until his death on the 20th of February 2013. He's interred at Highgate Cemetery near Marks. He claimed to be a Marxist in his adolescence, and you can see his death mask is his image there. So he was someone who's fixated with status, so he felt he had probably been made it. He had a chip in his shoulder about the establishment. He detested them, but desperately wanted to be one of them, often buying status symbol, you know, fashion labels, things like that. Anyway, that's just a little bit about Leatherslade Farm. Sorry it wasn't a better perspective. There is a field over there. I wish I could have got into that one and given you a better view of the house. I didn't want to be savaged by those vicious hounds. That's enough from me. Please donate to me on PayPal, on Instagram, on PayPal or Patreon. Follow me on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, and so forth. Toodaloo.